I thought the chains on the barn doors were meant to keep people out, but when I finally broke them open and saw what was inside, I realized they were meant to keep the truth locked away forever. My grandmother hadn't abandoned me at all. She had been protecting me from something far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined, and the proof was hidden in a place no one dared to enter. The moment I stepped into that barn, everything I thought I knew about my life shattered like glass, and I understood why she had watched me from the shadows all those years, why she could never hold me, and why leaving me at that orphanage was the hardest and bravest thing she ever did. The wooden box with my name carved into it sat in the corner, covered in dust and surrounded by stacks of documents that would destroy powerful people, and inside that box was something that made my knees buckle and tears stream down my face, because it meant she had been there, close enough to touch me, close enough to hear my voice, but forced to stay hidden in the darkness while I grew up thinking I was unwanted and alone. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning I walked out of St. Catherine's Home for Children, the sky was the color of old bruises, purple and gray and threatening rain that never quite fell. I was 18 years and 4 months old, which meant I had spent exactly 17 years and 11 months inside those walls, sleeping in a bed that wasn't mine, eating food that tasted like cardboard, and answering to a name that felt like it belonged to someone else. The other kids who aged out usually had somewhere to go, some distant relative who felt obligated enough to offer a couch or a spare room. But I had nothing except a small cloth bag containing 2 pairs of jeans, 3 shirts, some underwear, a toothbrush, and a folded letter I had never opened. Miss Patricia, the director who had always looked at me with something between pity and suspicion, handed me the letter on my 16th birthday and told me it had been left with me when I arrived as an infant. She said the woman who brought me claimed to be a social worker, but there were no records, no files, nothing that proved I was supposed to be there except a note pinned to my blanket that read, "Keep her safe. Please God, keep her safe." For 2 years that letter sat in my drawer, unopened and terrifying, because I convinced myself it would say something I couldn't handle, that it would confirm I was unwanted or broken or cursed in some way that explained why nobody ever came for me. But on my last morning, with nowhere to go and no plan except to walk until my feet gave out, I finally opened it. The handwriting was shaky but elegant, the kind of cursive they don't teach anymore, and the paper smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. It said only one thing in black ink that had faded to gray over the years: "Come home when you're ready." Below that was an address in a town I had never heard of, Millbrook Springs, and a small hand-drawn map showing a road that led away from the main highway into what looked like empty farmland. The signature at the bottom made my hands shake so badly I almost dropped the paper. It said, "Your grandmother, Eleanor." I stood there in the empty hallway with my bag at my feet and that letter trembling in my fingers, and for the first time in my life, I felt something other than the dull ache of being forgotten. I felt confused and angry and desperate because every single person who worked at that orphanage, had told me my grandmother died before I was born, that I had no family, that I came from nowhere and belonged to no one. I spent my last $20 on a bus ticket to Millbrook Springs, riding for 6 hours through landscapes that grew increasingly desolate and forgotten. The other passengers got off one by one until it was just me and an elderly man who smelled like tobacco and kept muttering to himself about the weather. When the driver finally called out Millbrook Springs, I was the only one who stood up, and he looked at me in the rearview mirror with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You sure this is where you want to be, kid?" he asked, and I nodded even though I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The town was exactly what I expected from a place nobody mentioned: a single main street with half the shops boarded up, a gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, and a diner with a flickering neon sign that buzzed like a dying insect. I stood on the cracked sidewalk with my bag and my letter and tried to figure out which direction to walk, and that's when I noticed people were staring at me from behind dirty windows and half-open doors, their faces pale and unwelcoming. I asked an old woman sitting outside the general store if she knew how to find the address on my letter, and her reaction made my stomach drop. Her eyes went wide, and she actually took a step back, clutching her purse like I might try to steal it. "You're going to the Whitmore farm?" she whispered, and the way she said it made it sound like I had just announced plans to walk into hell itself. I told her yes, that I was looking for my grandmother Eleanor Whitmore, and she made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. "Eleanor Whitmore disappeared 15 years ago, child. That farm has been empty ever since, and nobody goes near it. Whatever you're looking for out there, I promise you won't find anything but heartache and bad memories." She refused to say anything else, just shuffled back inside and locked the door behind her, leaving me standing alone on that empty street with the weight of her words pressing down on my chest. But I had nowhere else to go, so I started walking. The map showed the farm was about 3 miles outside of town, down a dirt road that branched off from the main highway. My shoes weren't meant for hiking, and my bag grew heavier with each step, but I kept going because the alternative was turning back to nothing. The landscape changed as I walked, the few scattered houses giving way to empty fields choked with weeds and rusty equipment left to rot under the endless sky. The dirt road was barely visible, more like a suggestion of a path than an actual route, and several times I wondered if I had taken a wrong turn. Then I saw it rising up from the flat horizon like a ghost made solid, an old 2-story farmhouse with peeling white paint and a sagging porch, surrounded by fields that had gone wild with neglect. Behind the house stood a massive barn, its red paint almost completely faded to gray, and even from a distance I could see the heavy chains wrapped around the doors, secured with a padlock that looked newer than anything else on the property. I stood at the edge of what had once been a driveway and stared at the place that was supposed to be my home, and I felt something twist inside my chest that was equal parts longing and dread. The farmhouse looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry, not peacefully closed up, but left as if someone had simply walked away mid-task and never returned. One of the upstairs windows was broken, covered with a piece of warped plywood that had come partially loose. The porch steps were rotting through in places, dangerous to walk on without testing each board first. But what drew my attention again and again was the barn, sitting there like a massive secret, locked up tight, and somehow more present than everything else. I had grown up in a place full of locked doors, rooms I wasn't allowed to enter and questions I wasn't allowed to ask, but I had never seen anything locked quite like this. The chains weren't just securing the doors, they were wrapped multiple times, crisscrossing and looping as if someone was desperately afraid of what might get out or what might get in. I approached the house first because I wasn't ready to face the barn yet, wasn't ready to confront whatever my grandmother had locked away so deliberately. The front door was unlocked, which surprised me, and when I pushed it open the hinges screamed with rust and neglect. The smell hit me immediately, not decay exactly, but the heavy scent of dust and stale air and time passing without anyone to witness it. I stepped inside and my footsteps echoed on the wooden floors, each sound seeming too loud in the suffocating silence. The furniture was still there, covered in sheets that had turned gray with dust, and there were signs everywhere of a life interrupted. A coffee cup sat on the kitchen counter, the liquid inside long since evaporated to a dark stain. A book lay open on the arm of a chair, its pages yellowed and warped. A coat hung on a hook by the door, waiting for someone who would never come back to wear it. I moved through the house like I was walking through a museum of someone else's life, touching things carefully and trying to imagine the woman who had lived here. In the kitchen, I found cabinets still stocked with canned goods that had expired years ago, plates and cups arranged neatly, as if she might need them at any moment. The refrigerator was empty and unplugged, its door hanging open to prevent mold. Upstairs there were 3 bedrooms, 2 of them completely bare and one that was clearly hers. This room felt different from the rest of the house, more deliberately preserved, and when I stepped inside, I felt like I was intruding on something sacred. The bed was made with a faded quilt, the pattern showing flowers that had once been bright blue but had faded to pale gray. A dresser stood against one wall, its surface covered with framed photographs that made my breath catch in my throat. I picked up the first photograph with trembling hands and stared at a woman I had never seen before but somehow recognized in the deepest part of myself. She was standing in front of this very farmhouse, younger and smiling, her hair dark and long, and her eyes the same unusual shade of green that I saw every time I looked in a mirror. She wore a simple dress and had her hand raised to shield her eyes from the sun, and she looked happy in a way that made my chest ache. The next photograph showed her holding a baby, wrapped in a white blanket, and the way she looked at that child made it clear this was the most precious thing in her world. I turned the frame over and found writing on the back, "Eleanor and Margaret, Spring 1987. Margaret was my mother's name, the only thing I knew about her besides the fact that she died when I was born. The story I had been told was that she was young and alone and unprepared for a baby, that she hemorrhaged during delivery and died before anyone could save her, that I was given to the state because there was no family to claim me. But if Eleanor was alive in 1987, holding her daughter with such obvious love, then why was I told she died before I was born? I set that photograph down and picked up another, and each one raised more questions than answers. There were pictures of my mother growing up, from a chubby toddler to a gangly teenager to a beautiful young woman with my same green eyes and dark hair. There were pictures of this farm in better days, with neat fields and a garden bursting with vegetables and chickens scratching in the yard. And then there was a picture that made everything inside me go still and cold. It showed the front gates of St. Catherine's Home for Children, the same gates I had walked through just that morning, and standing on the sidewalk across the street was Eleanor. She was older in this photo, her hair gray and her face lined with age and worry, and she was staring at those gates with an expression of such profound sadness that I felt tears burning in my eyes. The date stamped on the back was from 8 years ago. I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, clutching that photograph and trying to breathe through the realization washing over me. She had been there. My grandmother had been standing outside the orphanage, close enough that I might have walked right past her, close enough to hear the sounds of children playing in the yard, and she had been watching. How many times had she come? How many birthdays or holidays or ordinary days had she stood on that sidewalk, separated from me by nothing but a fence and secrets I didn't understand? I went through the rest of the photographs with shaking hands and found more of the same, different years and different seasons, but always the same location. Eleanor standing across from St. Catherine's, sometimes in summer clothes and sometimes bundled against winter cold, always alone and always staring at those gates like she was trying to will herself to cross the street and go inside. The most recent one was dated just 3 years ago, which meant she had been alive long after the town claimed she disappeared. I needed answers, and I needed them now. So I started searching the house more systematically, opening drawers and closets and looking for anything that might explain what had happened. In the bottom drawer of her dresser, hidden under old sweaters that smelled of mothballs and lavender, I found a wooden box with a small brass clasp. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Eleanor and sorted by date. I pulled out the oldest one, postmarked 1992, and unfolded the brittle paper. It was from a law firm I had never heard of, and the language was formal and threatening. They were writing to inform her that the property she owned was subject to an ongoing legal dispute, that her claim to the land was being contested by other family members, and that she was advised to vacate the premises immediately to avoid further complications. The letter ended with a barely veiled threat about what might happen if she refused to cooperate. The next letter was from 6 months later, from a different law firm, and this one was even more hostile. They claimed that Eleanor had a legally occupied land that rightfully belonged to her late husband's relatives, that she had no legitimate claim to the property, and that legal action would be taken if she did not leave voluntarily. There were letters from banks threatening foreclosure, letters from people claiming she owed them money, letters from relatives I had never heard of demanding their share of an inheritance. And woven through all of this were letters of a different kind, handwritten and personal, from someone who signed their name simply as R. These letters were filled with apologies and promises, with declarations that he was working on a solution and begging her to be patient. The most chilling one was dated just a few months before I was born. Eleanor, you have to understand the position I'm in. They know about Margaret and the baby. They're saying things, making threats. If you don't give up the farm, they're going to take the child when she's born. They're going to make sure you never see her again. Please just sign the papers and walk away. It's the only way to keep them safe. I sat on the floor of her bedroom with these letters spread around me like evidence at a crime scene, and I started to piece together a story that made my blood run cold. Someone had wanted this farm badly enough to destroy my grandmother's life. They had used legal pressure and personal threats, and ultimately they had used me, an innocent baby, as leverage to force her hand. The final letter in the box was in Eleanor's own handwriting, never sent, the paper tear-stained and the words barely legible. I gave her up. God forgive me. I gave my granddaughter to the orphanage because they said it was the only way to keep her alive. They promised if I signed over the farm and disappeared, they would leave her alone. They promised she would be safe. I stood outside that place today and watched her playing in the yard, so small and beautiful and mine, and I couldn't go to her. I couldn't hold her or tell her I love her or explain why I had to do this. I am watching my own blood grow up behind those walls, and there is nothing I can do except pray that one day she'll forgive me. The farm is gone. They took it all. But I kept the evidence. I kept every document, every recording, every piece of proof of what they did. It's all in the barn, locked away where they'll never find it. And someday she'll come looking and she'll know the truth. Someday my granddaughter will know that I never stopped fighting for her. I don't know how long I sat there crying, the letters clutched in my hands and my grandmother's pain bleeding into my own. Everything I thought I knew was a lie. I wasn't abandoned because I was unwanted. I was hidden because I was in danger. My grandmother hadn't died before I was born. She had been forced to give me up to save my life. And then she had spent years watching me from a distance, powerless to do anything except stand on a sidewalk and hope I could feel her love reaching across the impossible space between us. The orphanage wasn't a place I was dumped because nobody wanted me. It was a sanctuary, the only place where powerful people with resources and connections couldn't easily reach me. And my grandmother had lived with that choice every day, sacrificing her own happiness and her only connection to her daughter's child because she believed it was the only way to keep me safe. I needed to see what was in the barn. I needed to know what she had locked away, what evidence she had collected that was important enough to guard even after she disappeared. I stood up on shaky legs and wiped my face with the back of my hand, then made my way downstairs and out into the fading afternoon light. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting everything in shades of orange and purple, and the barn loomed ahead of me like a monument to secrets and sacrifice. Up close the chains looked even more serious, thick and heavy and secured with a padlock that had to be bolt cutters or nothing. I walked around the entire structure looking for another way in, but every door and window was sealed tight, and the wood was solid despite its weathered appearance. I was going to need tools. I went back to the house and searched until I found a small shed behind the kitchen that had once been used for storing garden equipment. Most of it was rusted beyond use, but I found a heavy sledgehammer with a wooden handle that still seemed solid. I also found a pry bar and a pair of work gloves that were too big for my hands, but better than nothing. Armed with these tools, I returned to the barn just as the last light was fading from the sky, and I stood there for a moment gathering my courage. Whatever was inside had been locked away for at least 15 years, hidden and protected and waiting for someone to come looking. My grandmother had bet everything that one day I would stand in this exact spot, that I would be smart enough and brave enough to break these chains and finish what she started. The first swing of the sledgehammer rang out across the empty fields like a church bell, loud and clear and impossible to ignore. I hit the padlock again and again, and the sound echoed back from the hills and the distant town. I imagined people in Millbrook Springs hearing that sound and knowing that someone was at the Whitmore farm, that someone was breaking into the barn they had avoided for 15 years. The lock held for longer than I expected, but finally the metal shackle bent and twisted and gave way with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. The chains fell away in a rattling heap, and I stood there breathing hard, my arms aching and my hands blistered even through the gloves. I pulled open the barn doors, and they moved smoothly despite their age, as if someone had oiled the hinges before locking them up. The interior was completely dark, and I used the flashlight on my cheap phone to pierce the shadows. The main floor of the barn was mostly empty except for some old farming equipment pushed against the walls and covered with tarps. But at the back, barely visible in the weak light, was a door I almost missed. It was built into the wall in a way that made it look like just another panel of wood, and if I hadn't been looking for something hidden, I might have walked right past it. This door wasn't chained, but it was locked with a simple padlock that gave way easily to the pry bar. Behind that door was a room about 12 feet square, windowless and musty, and when I shined my light inside, I saw what my grandmother had spent years protecting. The walls were lined with shelves, and those shelves were packed with boxes and folders and stacks of paper organized with obsessive care. There was a small desk in the corner with an old cassette recorder sitting on it, surrounded by tapes labeled with dates and names. And hanging on the wall was a map of the county, covered with pins and colored strings connecting different locations like some kind of detective's investigation board. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, and for the first time since leaving the orphanage, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I started with the desk because the cassette recorder seemed important, the kind of thing my grandmother would have placed in a position of prominence. I picked up the first tape, labeled simply, Our Confession 1, and after fumbling with the old machine, I managed to get it to play. The tape hissed and crackled for a moment, and then I heard a man's voice, slurred and rambling like he was drunk or exhausted. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry. I never wanted it to go this far. When my brothers first came to me about the farm, I thought they just wanted to talk about the will, about making sure everyone got a fair share. But they didn't want to share, they wanted everything. They said the land was too valuable to leave in the hands of one person, especially a woman who didn't understand business. They said you would ruin it, that you would let it go to waste. I told them you would never sell, and that's when they started talking about other options." The voice paused, and I heard the sound of liquid pouring, probably more alcohol. "They hired people to make your life difficult, to file false claims, and tie you up in legal battles you couldn't afford to fight. They bribed officials to look the other way when you tried to get help. And when Margaret got pregnant and refused to tell anyone who the father was, they saw an opportunity. They said if you gave up the farm quietly, they would make sure the baby was taken care of, placed with a good family. But if you fought them, if you tried to keep what was yours, they would make sure that child disappeared and you would never know what happened to her. I should have stopped them. I should have stood up to my own brothers and told them to go to hell. But I was weak and I was scared, and I convinced myself that you would understand, that you would see this was the only way." The tape continued with more rambling and apologies and self-pity, and by the end I understood that it was probably my grandfather or some other relative who had been caught between loyalty to family and doing the right thing. He had failed on both counts. I went through the other tapes and found similar recordings, some from the same man and others from different voices, all of them confessing to various crimes related to the land grab. There were discussions of forged documents, bribed judges, threatened witnesses, and a conspiracy that involved at least a dozen people working together to steal my grandmother's property. Some of the names I recognized from the letters, powerful families in the county who owned businesses and sat on boards and wielded influence like weapons. The boxes on the shelves contained supporting evidence for everything on the tapes. There were original property deeds showing that Eleanor Whitmore had inherited the farm legally from her husband, along with copies of the forged documents that had been used to contest her claim. There were bank statements showing large payments to lawyers and officials, with notations in my grandmother's handwriting connecting each payment to a specific action taken against her. There were photographs of meetings between the conspirators, taken from a distance with a camera that must have had a good zoom lens. There were affidavits from people who had been pressured to lie in court, collected after the fact when guilt or anger made them willing to tell the truth. And there were legal briefs that my grandmother had written herself, laying out the entire conspiracy in language that was clear and damning and impossible to ignore. This wasn't just evidence of a property dispute. This was proof of a criminal enterprise that had destroyed lives and stolen land from multiple families over the course of decades. The map on the wall showed at least 20 different properties that had been targeted, with lines connecting them all back to a central group of families who seemed to operate like a local mafia. My grandmother's farm was just one piece of a much larger pattern, and she had figured it out. She had spent years collecting evidence and building a case that would have brought down some of the most powerful people in the county. And then she had disappeared before she could use it. I was so focused on the documents that I almost missed the small wooden box sitting on the bottom shelf, partially hidden behind a stack of folders. It was made of plain pine, about the size of a shoebox, and carved into the lid in careful letters was my name. Not the name the orphanage had given me, not the legal name that appeared on my identification, but the name my mother had chosen. The name that appeared in Eleanor's letter but that I had never heard spoken aloud. I lifted the box with trembling hands and set it on the desk, then slowly opened the lid. Inside was a small stuffed rabbit, worn and faded and missing one button eye. I picked it up, and something inside me broke open because I remembered this toy. I remembered holding it when I was very small, sleeping with it every night, carrying it everywhere until one day it disappeared and I cried for hours and nobody could figure out what had happened to it. But I knew now. Somehow my grandmother had gotten close enough to take it, probably during one of her visits to watch me from across the street. Maybe she bribed someone who worked at the orphanage, or maybe she had waited until we were playing outside and created a distraction. However she had done it, she had taken this toy that smelled like me and held it and kept it safe in a box with my real name on it. And the thought of her sitting alone in this hidden room, holding this rabbit and remembering the granddaughter she couldn't touch, made me sob so hard I thought I might be sick. She had been there. She had been close enough to touch me, close enough to hear my voice and see my face. And she had taken this one small piece of me to hold on to when the distance became unbearable. Under the rabbit was a letter, this one sealed in an envelope with my name written across the front in that same elegant handwriting. I opened it carefully, afraid the old paper might crumble in my hands, and read the words my grandmother had left for me. My dearest girl, if you're reading this, then you found your way home, and I am either gone or too far away to come back to you. I want you to know that giving you up was the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than losing your grandfather, harder than watching your mother die, harder than anything I thought a human heart could survive. But I survived it because I had to, because keeping you alive was more important than my own happiness or comfort or sanity. I stood outside that orphanage on your first birthday and watched through the fence as they brought out a cake with one candle. I was there on your first day of school when you cried and clung to Miss Patricia's hand. I was there on Christmas mornings and Halloween nights and every ordinary Tuesday when nothing special happened except that you were alive and growing and becoming yourself. I collected these photographs and this evidence not because I wanted revenge, though I won't pretend I don't want these people to pay for what they did. I collected it because I wanted you to understand that you were never unwanted, never a burden, never anything less than the most precious and beloved child in this world. The people who forced me to give you up did it for money and land and power, and I am leaving you the proof so that you can decide what to do with it. You can go to the authorities and expose them. You can burn it all and walk away. You can sell the farm if it's still standing and use the money to build a new life somewhere far from this cursed place. Whatever you choose, know that I loved you every single day of your life, that I watched you grow from a distance and felt pride and joy and heartbreak in equal measure. You are my blood and my legacy, and the fact that you're reading this means you were brave enough to come looking for answers. That makes you stronger than I ever was. Be safe, my darling girl. Be happy, and know that somewhere, whether I'm alive or gone, I am watching you and loving you and wishing I could have done things differently. You were never alone, even when you felt most abandoned. I was always there, just out of sight, keeping watch. Your grandmother, Eleanor." I sat in that hidden room with the letter in one hand and the stuffed rabbit in the other, and I let myself cry for all the years we lost, for the childhood spent wondering why nobody wanted me, for the grandmother who sacrificed everything and got nothing in return except the knowledge that I was safe. The cassette tapes and documents and photographs surrounded me like soldiers standing guard, and I understood that this room was more than just evidence of a crime. It was a love letter, a final gift from someone who had given up everything else. She had preserved this truth because she knew one day I would need it, and she had trusted me to be strong enough to handle it when the time came. But as I sat there in the darkness with only my phone's dying flashlight for company, I started to realize something else. My grandmother had disappeared 15 years ago, according to the people in town, but these photographs of her watching the orphanage were dated much more recently. She hadn't disappeared all those years ago. She had gone into hiding, probably because the people who had stolen her farm realized she had evidence against them. She had lived somewhere close enough to keep visiting me, close enough to keep watching, and that meant there was a chance, however small, that she was still out there somewhere. The letter talked about being gone or too far away, not about being dead. It left room for possibility, for hope, for the chance that this story wasn't over. I gathered up the most important documents and stuffed them into my bag, then took the wooden box with the rabbit and the letter. I left the rest of the evidence where it was, carefully organized and waiting, because I needed to think about what to do with it. The people named in these documents were powerful and dangerous, and they had already destroyed multiple lives to get what they wanted. Going up against them would require more than just proof. It would require strategy and support, and probably resources I didn't have. But I also knew I couldn't just walk away and pretend I had never found this place. My grandmother had counted on me to finish what she started, and walking away would mean all her sacrifice had been for nothing. I locked up the hidden room and made my way out of the barn, pulling the doors shut behind me even though the chains were broken and anyone could walk in now. The night had grown cold and the stars were out in force, more stars than I had ever seen in my life because there were no city lights to wash them out. I stood there in the yard of my grandmother's farm and looked up at that endless sky, and for the first time since leaving the orphanage, I felt like I had a purpose beyond just surviving. I had a mission and a legacy and proof that I came from someone who fought back against impossible odds. I went back into the farmhouse and found some old blankets in a closet, then made myself a nest on the couch in the living room because I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my grandmother's bed. As I lay there in the darkness listening to the house settle and creak around me, I thought about the path ahead. I could take this evidence to the police, but the documents suggested local law enforcement had been compromised, that some of the officers had taken bribes or looked the other way when they should have investigated. I could go to state authorities or federal investigators, but that would take time, and there was no guarantee they would take me seriously. A teenage girl fresh out of an orphanage with wild accusations against prominent families didn't exactly scream credible witness. Or I could do what my grandmother had apparently planned, which was to expose everything publicly in a way that made it impossible to ignore or cover up. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities and plans and fear about what might happen when the wrong people found out I had discovered the evidence. The people who had stolen this farm and threatened my family were still out there, still powerful, still dangerous. They thought the evidence was buried with my grandmother, that their secrets had died with her disappearance. Learning that someone had found the barn and opened it up would make me a target, and unlike my grandmother, I didn't have years of experience or resources to protect myself. But I also had something she didn't have when she started. I had her complete investigation ready to use, and I had the righteous anger of someone who had spent 18 years paying for other people's crimes. When dawn light started filtering through the dirty windows, I got up and started exploring the house more thoroughly. I found more letters and documents scattered throughout, pieces of my grandmother's life that painted a picture of a woman who was smart and determined and utterly alone in her fight. I found a journal where she had recorded every visit to the orphanage, noting what I was wearing and how I looked, and whether I seemed happy or sad. Reading those entries was both comforting and devastating because it meant she had been there for every milestone, every important moment, but always separated by that fence and the terrible choice she had made to keep me safe. In the journal's final entry, dated 2 years ago, she wrote about watching me graduate from middle school, about how proud she was and how much I looked like my mother. She wrote about wanting to cross the street and introduce herself, about being tired of hiding and tired of watching from a distance. And then the entry ended with a chilling sentence. I think they know I'm still watching. I saw someone following me today, a man I recognized from the early days of the fight. I may need to go farther away, find somewhere they can't track me, but I'll come back. When she's old enough to understand, when she's strong enough to handle the truth, I'll find a way to bring her home. That was the last entry in the journal, and it confirmed what I had suspected. She hadn't disappeared because she wanted to. She had been forced to run because her enemies had found her. I spent 3 days at the farm, going through everything and trying to decide what to do next. I had no money, no job, nowhere else to live, and I was sitting on evidence of crimes that powerful people would kill to keep hidden. The practical side of my brain said I should walk away, take what little I could carry, and disappear into some city where I could start over and forget about all of this. But the part of me that had inherited my grandmother's stubbornness and sense of justice said that walking away would make her sacrifice meaningless. She had given up everything, including the chance to know me, because she believed the truth mattered. She had trusted that one day I would be strong enough and brave enough to use what she had left behind. And that trust felt like a sacred responsibility I couldn't abandon. On the 4th morning, I was woken by the sound of a vehicle approaching, tires crunching on the gravel drive I had walked up days before. My heart started pounding, and I got up quickly, peering through the dirty window to see an old pickup truck pulling up in front of the house. A man got out, older and weathered-looking, wearing work clothes and moving with the careful stiffness of someone whose joints don't work as well as they used to. He stood there looking at the house for a long moment, then started walking toward the front door. I considered hiding, but realized that was pointless. If he was here looking for me, then he already knew I was inside. And if he was just here checking on the property, then hiding would only make things worse. So I opened the door before he could knock, and we stood there looking at each other, both surprised and both uncertain. "I'm not trespassing," I said before he could speak, holding up the letter with Eleanor's handwriting. "This is my grandmother's farm. I'm her granddaughter." The man's weathered face went pale, and he took a step back, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the porch railing. He stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, his eyes moving over my face like he was seeing a ghost. "You're Margaret's daughter," he whispered, and it wasn't a question. "You have her eyes. Jesus Christ, you have Eleanor's eyes too." "Who are you?" I demanded, suddenly aware of how isolated I was out here, how nobody knew where I was or that I existed beyond the walls of that orphanage. "My name is Robert Whitmore," he said slowly, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach because I recognized that name from the tapes. The man who had apologized but done nothing to stop what happened. "I'm your grandfather." I should have slammed the door in his face. I should have told him to leave and never come back. But 18 years of wondering about family, of lying awake at night and imagining what it would be like to hear someone call me by my real name and claim me as their own, made me hesitate. "The tapes," I said. "I heard the tapes in the barn. You let them destroy her. You let them take everything." His face crumpled, and he aged 10 years in front of me. "I know. God forgive me. I know what I did. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because 3 days ago someone in town called me and said they heard hammering coming from this property, said someone was breaking into the barn. I knew it had to be you. Eleanor sent me a letter years ago, told me that if anything happened to her, if she disappeared or died, I should watch for you. She said you would come eventually, that she had left you a way to find this place, and when you did, I was supposed to help you. Help me. I laughed, and it came out bitter and sharp. You didn't help her when she needed it. Why would I trust you now? Because she did, he said simply. Eleanor hated me for what I did, and she had every right to. But in her letter, she said you would need someone who knew the families involved, someone who understood how they operated and what they were capable of. She said I owed her a debt I could never repay, but I could start by making sure her granddaughter survived long enough to use what she left behind. He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, clearly aware that I was watching his every move, and pulled out a yellowed envelope. This is the letter she sent me. Read it if you don't believe me. I took the envelope but didn't open it, just stood there staring at this man who was technically family, but felt like a stranger wearing a familiar mask. If you're here to help, then tell me what happened to her. The town says she disappeared 15 years ago, but I found photographs dated from 3 years ago. Where is she? Robert's expression turned so sad, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I don't know. And that's the God's honest truth. She contacted me occasionally over the years, always careful, always from different places. She would send updates about you, tell me you were healthy and growing up strong. The last time I heard from her was 2 years ago. She said the Hendersons had found out she was still around, that they had people looking for her. She said she had to go deeper underground, that it wasn't safe to contact anyone anymore. After that, nothing. The Hendersons, I repeated, and the name clicked with something I had seen in the documents. They're the ones who organized everything? The land grab. The Hendersons, the Pratts, the Ashfords. 3 families that have run this county like their personal kingdom for generations. They've stolen land, bribed officials, ruined anyone who got in their way. Your grandmother's farm was valuable because of what's under it. Water rights and mineral deposits that are worth millions. They couldn't buy her out, so they destroyed her life instead. He paused and looked toward the barn. You found the evidence then. You opened the room. All of it, I confirmed. Tapes, documents, photographs. Enough to put them all in prison for a very long time. Robert nodded slowly. Then you need to leave. Right now? Pack up whatever you can carry and get as far from here as possible, because if they find out what you've discovered, they will kill you. These aren't people who make threats they don't follow through on. I'm not running, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. My grandmother spent years collecting that evidence because she wanted justice. I'm not going to let her sacrifice be for nothing. Justice. Robert's voice rose. There is no justice here, only survival. Eleanor tried to fight them through legal channels, and they buried her in paperwork and threats until she had to give up her granddaughter just to keep you alive. What makes you think an 18-year-old girl with no money and no support is going to succeed where she failed? Because I have something she didn't, I said quietly. I have everything she learned, everything she discovered, all in one place and ready to use. And I have nothing to lose. They already took my childhood, my family, my identity. There's nothing left for them to threaten me with. Robert stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. Recognition maybe, or respect, or just the acknowledgement that I was as stubborn as the woman who had raised my mother. You really are her granddaughter, he said finally. That same fire in your eyes, that same unwillingness to back down even when you should. He sighed heavily. If you're determined to do this, then we need to be smart about it. The local police won't help. Half of them are on the family's payroll. State investigators might listen, but it will take time, and time is something you don't have. The moment someone realizes you've opened that barn, the clock starts ticking. Then what do you suggest? Media, he said. Get the evidence to reporters, multiple sources at once, so they can't suppress it all. Make it public before they can threaten or bribe people into silence. And we need to do it fast, before they know what's happening. We spent the next hour making a plan. Robert had contacts from his years working in construction, people who had been hurt by the 3 families and would be willing to help expose them. He knew which reporters at the regional newspapers were actually independent, which ones couldn't be bought off or scared away. While we talked, I loaded the most damning evidence into my bag, choosing carefully because I could only carry so much. The confession tapes went in first, then the documents showing the forged deeds and bribed officials, then photographs that proved conspiracy meetings had taken place. "There's one more thing," Robert said as we worked. "Your grandmother had a safe deposit box at a bank in the next county. She gave me the key years ago and made me promise not to open it unless something happened to her. Inside are copies of everything you're looking at now. Plus one thing she said was the most important piece of evidence, something that would connect all the dots and leave no room for doubt. I never looked because I was afraid of what I might find, afraid of what it would force me to do. But if we're going to expose these people, we need everything she had." "Then let's go get it," I said. The drive to the bank took 40 minutes through countryside that grew increasingly populated as we left the desolation of Millbrook Springs behind. Robert drove in silence while I stared out the window and tried to process everything that had happened in the last 4 days. I had gone from being a girl with no past to someone sitting on evidence that could destroy powerful people, and the weight of that responsibility felt crushing. But underneath the fear and uncertainty was something else, something that felt like purpose. My grandmother had trusted me with this truth, had bet her life on the possibility that one day I would be strong enough to finish what she started. I couldn't let her down. The bank was small and old-fashioned, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately. Robert spoke to the manager, showed identification, produced the key Eleanor had given him. We were led to a private room where a long, narrow box was placed on the table between us. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were indeed copies of the major documents from the barn, organized and labeled with Eleanor's careful handwriting. But there was also a USB drive, modern and out of place among all the paper, and a letter addressed to me. I read the letter first while Robert examined the documents. "My darling girl, if you're reading this, then Robert kept his promise and brought you here. On this drive is video footage that I recorded secretly over the course of 5 years. Meetings between the families where they discussed their crimes openly, thinking they were safe and untouchable. Conversations where they laughed about the people they had destroyed and the lives they had ruined. And most importantly, footage from the night they made their final threat against you, when you were just a baby. They gathered at the old Henderson estate and drank whiskey and discussed what they would do if I refused to sign over my farm. They talked about you like you were a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. I recorded every word. This footage is the evidence that will end them, that will prove beyond any doubt what kind of monsters hide behind respectable names and positions of power. Use it wisely. Use it to burn their world down. All my love, Eleanor." I plugged the USB drive into the laptop Robert had brought, and we watched in silence as grainy video footage played on the screen. The first file showed a group of well-dressed men sitting around a dining room table, their faces clear despite the poor lighting. I recognized some of them from photographs in the barn. They were drinking and laughing, and as I listened to their conversation, I felt rage building in my chest like pressure behind a dam. They talked about families they had forced off their land, about judges they had paid to rule in their favor, about people who had gotten in their way and then mysteriously left town or had accidents. And then the conversation turned to Eleanor Whitmore and her stubborn refusal to cooperate. "The woman's insane," one man said, his face red from alcohol. "We've offered her fair market value 3 times over. We've tried being reasonable, but she won't budge." "Then we stop being reasonable," another voice said, and I recognized the speaker as Marcus Henderson from the photographs. Current county commissioner, respected businessman, pillar of the community. "We know about the daughter and the baby. We use them as leverage." "You're talking about threatening an infant," Robert's voice said from the video, younger but recognizable. "I'm talking about making Eleanor understand that she has more to lose than property," Marcus replied coldly. "We tell her if she signs over the farm and disappears, the baby will be safe, placed in a good home. But if she fights us, if she tries to expose what we've done, the baby disappears permanently. Simple as that." The other men murmured agreement while Robert sat in silence, and I felt sick watching my grandfather fail to stand up, fail to object, failed to do anything except let these men plan to use me as a weapon against my grandmother. The video continued with more details, names and dates, and amounts of money that had changed hands. It was damning, undeniable, and exactly what we needed. There were 5 more videos on the drive, each one showing different meetings and conversations, building a comprehensive case of conspiracy and criminal enterprise that spanned decades. By the time we finished watching, I felt hollowed out and filled with rage in equal measure. These men had destroyed my grandmother's life, stolen my childhood, and then gone about their business as if they had done nothing wrong, as if the people they hurt were just collateral damage in their pursuit of wealth and power. We send this to every news organization we can think of, I said. Tonight. Right now. We make copies and distribute them before anyone knows we have them. Robert nodded. I have a friend who runs a blog that covers local corruption. He's been trying to expose these families for years, but never had enough proof. This will give him everything he needs. I also know reporters at 3 different newspapers and a television station in the state capital. We send it everywhere at once. We spent the next 6 hours in a motel room Robert paid for, using his laptop to upload and send copies of all the evidence. We emailed reporters with detailed explanations and timestamps. We uploaded videos to secure servers with anonymous accounts. We sent physical copies via overnight delivery to news organizations and law enforcement agencies at the state and federal level. By the time we were done, my eyes burned from staring at the screen and my hands ached from typing, but I felt something close to satisfaction. The truth was out there now, distributed too widely to be suppressed, and all we could do was wait for the consequences. What happens now? I asked as we sat in the motel room, eating takeout food that tasted like cardboard. Now we wait, Robert said. The story will break in the next day or 2. Once it does, the families will try to spin it, claim the evidence is fabricated or taken out of context. But with video footage and documentation and multiple sources all confirming the same story, they won't be able to make it go away. There will be investigations, arrests, trials. It's going to get ugly. And me? I asked quietly. What happens to me? Robert looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Eleanor's will left the farm to you, assuming it still legally belongs to her. With this evidence coming out, the property seizure will be challenged and probably overturned. You'll have a home and probably some money from damages. You'll have options you never had before. I don't want their money, I said. I want her back. I want my grandmother to walk through that door and tell me everything is going to be okay. I know, Robert said softly. I want that too. But wanting doesn't change what is. Eleanor made her choices, and whether she's alive somewhere in hiding or whether she's gone, she did everything she did for you. The best way to honor that is to live, to use what she gave you and build something good from all this pain. That night, I lay awake in the uncomfortable motel bed and thought about Eleanor standing outside St. Catherine's, watching me grow up from a distance. I thought about her sitting in that hidden room in the barn, recording her findings and organizing evidence with meticulous care. I thought about the stuffed rabbit she had taken and kept, a small piece of me to hold on to when the loneliness became unbearable. And I thought about the letter she had written, trusting that one day I would be strong enough and brave enough to finish what she started. The story broke 2 days later, front page news in multiple papers, lead story on television broadcasts. Decades of corruption exposed in county land scandal. The Henderson family, the Pratts, the Ashfords, their carefully constructed reputations crumbled in hours. Reporters descended on Millbrook Springs like locusts, interviewing everyone who had ever been hurt by these families, uncovering more victims and more crimes. Law enforcement agencies announced investigations. Politicians who had taken money from the families scrambled to distance themselves. It was everything Eleanor had worked toward, everything she had sacrificed for, and watching it unfold on television felt surreal. Marcus Henderson held a press conference where he denied everything, claimed the evidence was fabricated by enemies trying to bring down successful families. But his voice shook and his hands trembled, and nobody believed him. Within a week, he was arrested along with 5 other men, charged with conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and a dozen other crimes. The investigation spread outward like ripples from a stone thrown in water, touching everything these families had been involved in for generations. I stayed in that motel room for 2 weeks while Robert handled the legal aspects and fielded calls from reporters who wanted to interview me. I gave one statement through a lawyer Robert hired, explaining who I was and how I had found the evidence, but I refused to appear on camera or answer detailed questions. This wasn't about me becoming famous or being seen as a hero. This was about finishing what my grandmother started and making sure her sacrifice meant something. The farm was returned to me through a legal process I didn't fully understand, something about fraudulent seizure and wrongful claims. I went back there on a cold morning in late October, driving down that dirt road with Robert beside me. The house looked exactly as I had left it, frozen in time and waiting. But something felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from the property itself. We walked through the rooms, and I showed him the photographs, the letters, the journal where Eleanor had recorded every visit to the orphanage. "She never stopped loving you," Robert said quietly. "Even when she hated me, even when she was angry at the world, she never stopped loving you." "I know," I said. "I just wish I had known her, really known her, before all this happened." We were standing in the kitchen when we heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. My first instinct was fear, thinking that someone from the families had come looking for revenge. But when we looked out the window, we saw an old sedan pulling up slowly, carefully, like the driver was uncertain about being there. The car stopped, and for a long moment nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened, and a woman got out. She was old, her hair completely gray, her movements stiff and slow. She wore a simple dress and a cardigan that had seen better days. She stood beside her car looking at the farmhouse with an expression of such longing and fear that my breath caught in my throat. And then she turned and looked directly at me through the window, and I saw eyes the exact same shade of green as my own, eyes that had watched me from across the street at St. Catherine's, eyes that had loved me from a distance for 18 years. "Eleanor," Robert whispered beside me, his voice choked with emotion. I was moving before I realized it, running through the house and out the front door, stumbling down the porch steps and across the overgrown yard. She met me halfway, her arms opening, and when we collided it felt like every missing piece of my life finally sliding into place. She smelled like lavender and old wood, exactly like her letter, and she was crying, and I was crying, and neither of us could speak through the sobs. "I'm sorry," she finally managed to say, her voice hoarse and broken. "I'm so sorry, my darling girl. I wanted to come for you so many times. I stood outside those gates and wanted to tear them down and take you home where you belonged." "I know," I said into her shoulder, holding on like she might disappear if I let go. "I found everything. I found the barn and the letters and the rabbit. I found all of it." She pulled back to look at me, her hands cupping my face like she was memorizing every feature. "You finished it," she said. "I saw the news. I saw what you did. You were so much braver than I ever was. You spent 18 years protecting me," I said. "You gave up everything. How is that not brave?" We stood there in the yard of her farm that was now my farm, and held on to each other while Robert watched from the porch with tears streaming down his weathered face. Eleanor told me she had been living in a small town 3 states away, working as a seamstress and keeping her head down, always afraid that they would find her and make good on their threats. When she saw the news breaking and realized the families were being arrested, she had driven straight through the night to come home, to finally see me without having to hide in shadows. "I have so many questions," I told her. "And I have so many answers," she said. "We have time now. We have all the time in the world." And as the sun set behind the hills, casting everything in shades of orange and gold, I finally understood what home meant. Not a place or a building, but this moment, this person who had fought for me when I didn't even know I needed fighting for, who had sacrificed everything and asked for nothing in return except that I survive and someday understand the truth. The chains on the barn doors had been broken, the secrets exposed to light, and the woman who had loved me from a distance was finally able to hold me close. We walked back toward the house together, her arm around my shoulders and my head against hers, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't alone. The wooden box with my name carved into it sat in the barn, the stuffed rabbit still inside, a testament to years of longing and loss. But that was the past now, kept safe but no longer defining us. We had survived. We had won. And whatever came next, we would face it together, grandmother and granddaughter, finally home where we belonged.